And joining us now, we're happy to welcome Graham Fraser, the Official Languages Commissioner of Canada. It's nice to have you in that chair.
Very nice to be here.
Well, we always start our interviews with people who run the agencies, boards, and commissions of government this way. What do you do?
Well, what I do is I receive complaints from people who feel they have not had their language rights respected, and I do research and promotion on use of both official languages. It was a job that was created in 1969 with the Official Languages Act so that there would be somebody who would monitor whether the federal government is living up to its obligations. And the purpose of the Official Languages Act is to ensure that French-speaking Canadians, including unilingual French-speaking Canadians, get the same level of service from the federal government as English-speaking Canadians, and that there be some protection for and promotion of minority language communities, whether it's French-speaking communities outside Quebec or the English-speaking communities in Quebec. So
has the job changed at all in the last 40 years?
The challenges shift in some ways. The law has been amended. One of the ways in which the law was amended in 1988 was to give federal public servants in certain regions the right to work in their language of choice, which means that in the National Capital Region, in Montreal, and parts of Northern Ontario and New Brunswick, the individual public servant can say, I want to work in French, or in Quebec, I want to work in English, which means that their supervisor has to be in a position that they can evaluate them in their language, that they can read their reports, that they can, these people can participate in meetings in their language of choice. And then 5 years ago, the Act was amended again so that every federal institution now has a binding legal obligation to take positive measures for the growth and development of minority language communities, French outside Quebec, English in Quebec.
So are you supposed to be a bit of a champion of both official languages? Is it your idea to sort of encourage parents who are living in Northern Alberta to put their kids in French immersion, that
Absolutely,
kind of thing?
absolutely. There's that promotion aspect and also the protection aspect.
Okay.
And to a certain amount of prevention aspect as well, where we will talk to government departments and say, look, we see you've got a problem here and you should actually take some measures to deal with it. The public service is going through a major renewal as the baby boomers are retiring, and so there are 15,000 new jobs every year in the public service, and 5,000 of them require knowledge of both languages. So there's a real need to send out the message to government agencies, to universities, and to high schools that, look, Canada's largest employer needs people who speak both languages.
Is that the report you just brought out?
Just brought out Volume 2 last week, okay. And there's Volume 1 in the spring.
I'm going to quote from it, so you don't have to go through that. Here's what you found, and it wasn't, what you concluded wasn't great. Only 10 out of 16 institutions were able to provide bilingual service more than 80% of the time where required. Worse still, you concluded, only 2 of 16 greeted the public in person in both English and French, known as the active offer, more than 60% of the time. Some of the more glaring examples of poor service to the public came from Health Canada, Industry Canada, and Public Safety Canada. And I can see some people watching us right now saying, so what?
Well, one of the really important things about the Official Languages Act and about Canadian identity is that we have identified ourselves as a country in the Constitution, in the Official Languages Act, as a country with both official languages. Some people think that the purpose of the Official Languages Act is to make everybody bilingual.
It's not.
It's not. Never has been. It is about service. It is ensuring that Canadians can get service from their federal government in their language of choice. And the only way you know that you're going to be able to get that service is if people at the counter say, hello, bonjour. And so it is because if you don't get that indication from the person on the other side of the counter or when you're at the airport or crossing through, then how do you know? So there is an important obligation on the part of government departments to not only be able to provide the service, but to let people know that that service is available. And where that's particularly important is when people are arriving at the airport, they are coming to Canada or coming home to Canada, and they're being greeted by a customs official, and they have the right to be served in both languages.
Well, as long as we're at the airport, let me pick up on Air Canada, because I think you mentioned the fact that
Yes.
you're not happy about the notion that Air Canada doesn't announce in both official languages all the time.
Exactly. Air Canada has some serious systemic problems.
But they're a private company now, aren't they?
No. Well, they are. They are a private company, but they are a private company that was bought as a Crown corporation. And part of the deal was that if they were going to acquire this company in which Canadians over the generations had invested a substantial amount, and they were going to have the right to use the name of the country as part of the name of their company, then they had to keep up the same kind of language obligations to customers that Air Canada had done when it was a Crown corporation.
Let me ask you about benchmarks as well, because I think your survey points out that they're not meeting it 80% of the time. That was the benchmark.
Yeah.
And I guess some people might be asking, why would 80% be the benchmark? Wouldn't you want them saying hello, bonjour 100% of the time?
Absolutely.
So why isn't that the target?
Well, the target is definitely 100% of the time, but if you find that they're not even doing it 80% of the time, that's an indication of a more serious problem.
Okay.
Other benchmarks that we've established or other information that we've acquired shows that across the board, across the country, Francophones are able to get service from the federal government 75% of the time. So that's an overall general average, and that corresponds with, by and large, the kind of investigations that we do ourselves.
You didn't say good service, though. Are they able to get good service 75% of the time in the language of choice?
It always depends. I mean, one of the things that somebody from a French-speaking minority community said to me was, I'm really tired of talking to a government department and having somebody say to me, so do you want to speak to somebody who speaks French or do you want to speak to somebody who knows the file? People shouldn't have to make that choice.
Okay, humor me on this. Again, a lot of people who've watched these language wars over many, many decades might say, okay, if you're in Ottawa, absolutely you should be entitled to service in French or English, whichever. Or Moncton, New Brunswick, for that matter. That's an officially bilingual province, New Brunswick. However, most of this country functions either in French or English, not both. So why is it important for the tiny percentage of people who may be Francophones living in, I'll pluck anything out of the air here, Regina, that they be able to get federal government services in French in Regina?
Well, I think there are two reasons. One, and let's make a distinction here. There are the services that should be available so that somebody can communicate with their federal government. I mean, for example, I lived in Quebec City for 7 years. I was really glad that I could fill out my income tax in English and I could communicate with people in English. It didn't matter to me as much as a resident whether I could buy my postage stamps in English, but tourists coming to Quebec City, the post office is a really important institution if you're a traveler. And so there are those things that we should offer to Canadians as travelers, and those things that should be available to Canadians as citizens and as members of a community. And so there are two aspects of somebody living in Regina. One is to be able to communicate as individuals who want to be able to fill out get their pension applications, their passport applications, their tax information in the language of their choice. And then those things that should be available to a traveler. If you are taking a Pee Wee hockey team from Quebec City to Regina to play in a Pee Wee hockey tournament, then you actually ought to be able to get service at the airport, because those kids who are coming from Quebec City or Trois-Rivières or Rimouski are going to need to know from the announcement that when their flight is coming.
Although flip it the other way around, I think one of the, listen, this is a little personal example, probably irrelevant, but let me try. You know, when we, back in grade 10 in Hamilton, and we went to Quebec for the first time for one of these high school trips, you know, you had to know French.
Yes.
You did have to know French. And it wasn't enough to say, look, I'm an Anglophone in Quebec, and I should be able to get service wherever I want, whenever I want in English. So I'm wondering if the example of the Pee Wee hockey team, maybe they should have to learn English if they want to go to a tournament in Regina.
Well, the nature of the country is that absolutely we have two unilingual majorities that live side by side.
Right.
And so the key question is, how can we ensure that those two unilingual majorities get the services they need from the federal government? And how can they, if they are traveling to each other's part of the country, how can they get basic services?
Is that still the key question? I wonder if that's still the key question. I'm not here to argue with it. I'm throwing it out here for discussion. You know, I guess there's two kinds of rights in Canada. You got rights wherever you're a Canadian, you've got rights absolutely wherever you are, or you have geographic rights in Canada. And that seems to be the way the country is going. If you're a francophone, you got lots of rights in Quebec and not so much elsewhere. And if you're an anglophone, you got lots of rights in English Canada, not so much in Quebec.
But actually, there are now French language schools in every province. There are French language school boards in every province. It is now increasingly, through the work that's been done over the last 10 years by the federal government, increasingly possible to get health services in French in other parts of the country, in English in Quebec.
That's a wonderful thing, but the question is, should it be the law? Should it be the way it has to be?
It is, I think, if we are going to ensure that that is part of the vitality of these communities, in which there's a real challenge for English-speaking communities in Quebec. Everybody tends to think, when they think of English-speaking Quebec, they tend to think of Montreal.
Right.
Very different if you're living in Sherbrooke or in Quebec City or in the lower North Shore, in which they have faced exactly the same kinds of challenges, and sometimes more serious challenges than francophones living in Sudbury or in Manitoba or in Calgary or Vancouver. You've got an aging population, you've got a health system that is finding it more and more difficult to be able to serve an aging population, young people who are leaving. So
no, I don't think there's any question that the Canada you describe would be wonderful in many respects. But I guess a lot of people will observe that doesn't seem to be the direction we're going in.
Well, actually, there are some ways in which it is the direction we're going in. If you look at the numbers of bilingual Canadians, we have somewhat more than about 5.3 million bilingual Canadians. Of those, there are 2.8 million francophones who are bilingual and 2.5 million English-speaking Canadians who are bilingual. There are almost as many bilingual English-speaking Canadians as there are bilingual French-speaking Canadians.
But as a percentage of each.
But let's not worry about percentages. Let's talk about because basically what we're talking about is the people who can connect the parts of the country. Who are the people who can ensure that there is an ongoing dialogue and connection between these two unilingual communities with minority communities that need service, need to have the resources to thrive as minority language communities.
So you as a guy who previously as a journalist and now in this capacity, who've watched this debate unfold for 40 years, do you feel as if those connections are, about as low as they've ever been?
I think that one of the problems is that certainly in English-speaking Canada, there is a kind of a sensitivity to crisis, that if there's a referendum rolling around, then all of a sudden there's an oh my God. And what have we been doing about this in the last 15 years since the last referendum? But I think that on the other hand, you have 300,000 children in immersion French across the country. You have 1.4 million doing core French. Part of the problem, I think, is that the federal government, which is now Canada's largest employer, has not been sending a strong enough message to the universities saying, we need bilingual employees. The universities have not been sending a strong enough message to secondary schools saying, this is an important part of what we take seriously in our studies. There was a supplement in the Globe and Mail, Canadian Universities, a few weeks ago, in which they looked at the career choices of university students now. And in every category, whether it was arts, science, medicine, law, every single category, the #1 preferred employer was the Government of Canada. Huh. And so I think that means that there has to be a very strong message sent to those students. If you want to advance in the ranks, to the senior executive ranks of the Public Service of Canada, knowledge of both languages is extremely important.
Well, this is a perfect segue then to the next thing I want to talk about. Your little, I was going to say something, but it would be not on a family program, but you've had a bit of a contest with the National Post lately about how bilingual our Supreme Court ought to be. And here's what the National Post said. In the era of the Charter, the Supreme Court has so much power and passes judgment on so many critical issues that the only criterion for selecting its members should be superior legal reasoning. It would do Canada and Canadians a disservice to insist that their ability to hear the case in either official language without translation was more important than a lifetime of legal scholarship. That's a parlor trick compared to the ability to understand and synthesize complex legal arguments. There is, of course, a bill that has gone through, I guess, the House of Commons, and it's in the Senate right now, which would require future appointees to the Supreme Court to be functionally bilingual. So
to be able to hear testimony. First of all,
in both official languages.
In both official languages. That is not as demanding a test as we require of senior public servants. Senior public servants have to pass a writing test, they have to pass a reading test, and they have to pass what is an oral interaction test. What this legislation would require is that judges would be able to understand the oral testimony at the Supreme Court. And as things now stand, all it takes is one unilingual Supreme Court judge, and all of the French-speaking judges have to do their conversations in conference in English. And so the whole point of the Official Languages Act 40 years ago was that to create a situation in the public service where Francophone public servants would be able to use their own language and be understood.
Let's grant you this again. I'll go through the same dance I did last time. In the best of all perfect worlds, wouldn't it be wonderful if all 9 Supreme Court judges were perfectly bilingual?
8 of the 9 are. 8 of the 9 meet this criteria.
Perfectly?
They don't have to be perfectly. They have to be able to understand testimony. That's not perfect. And it also, right now, 35% of the provincial appeals that they hear come from Quebec. Those are cases that are argued in French, the factums are in French, the decisions are in French. Okay, they aren't translated. A unilingual judge only gets a short bench memo from his or her clerk, assuming he's got a bright enough bilingual clerk to do that. And so you've got this great massive documentation. I've talked to Supreme Court judges who are Anglophone, whose French is not sufficiently comfortable that they feel really at ease at a cocktail party or watching a movie, but they read well enough and they understand well enough that going through the documentation, they know the nature of the vocabulary, the context, so that they can understand the questions and they can understand the points and answer the questions. This is not a very high bar.
But the Post is saying there are 2 competing values here. One is legal scholarship and one is being bilingual.
But no, I don't think they're competing values. I don't think they're competing values at all. We have a bijural legal system. We have a system in which these 2 systems, the French system and the English system, meet at one point, and that's the Supreme Court. And so I think that to be a Supreme Court judge requires to be able, that you're the meeting point between these 2 legal cultures. Now, that does not mean that every judge should have a degree in civil law, but it does mean, I think, that a Supreme Court judge should at least be able to hear the testimony in the other language. And I think that also, if you have had a lifetime of legal scholarship, then that lifetime of legal scholarship is going to involve some knowledge of the jurisprudence that has been written and argued in French.
What would be wrong with having bilingualism be a desired quality for future judges to have, but not a prerequisite?
It's already a desired quality. All it takes is one unilingual judge, and then all of the Francophone judges have to work in their second language. And that's, I mean, bilingualism has always been a desired quality in Canadian life. We've always paid lip service to it. Until the Official Languages Act came along, there were no, it was desirable in the public service, but public servants who were Francophones did not have the right to work in their own language. This is something that Lester Pearson talked about in the House of Commons in 1966, even before the Official Languages Act, saying we had to create an environment in the public service that was welcoming to francophones where they could use their own language and be understood.
How close are we to that world today?
Not as close as we should be, in part because I think that what is key to make that a reality is leadership. And we've seen that leadership on the political side. We've seen Prime Minister Harper, an MP from Calgary, make a point of every declaration he makes in public and at international meetings, both in public and in private hearings. He speaks French, he speaks English. It is part of the message that he sends about the public face of Canada. It is unthinkable at this point to be a leader of a political party without being able to communicate to all Canadians in the language of their choice.
He's not the first Tory leader from Alberta to do it, too. Joe Clark did it back
Joe
in
Clark did it
1979.
back in 1979. I think that this is it is a real tribute to him, and I think it shows how far we have come as a country, that it is now difficult to imagine a unilingual Anglophone or a unilingual Francophone leading a political party. Well, I think the same, and similarly, that applies to the senior ranks of the public service. And I think it similarly is equal. Why should we have a lower standard for Supreme Court judges than we have for senior public servants?
I'm not my opinion. I'm going to say what people would say, because the law is different. It's one thing to campaign in 2 official languages. It's one thing to offer services to the public in 2 official languages. Law is complicated. There are nuances. It's difficult.
But you know what? Legislation in Canada is not translated. It is written in both languages.
Both
There's only
precedents.
one institution that gets to decide if there is a gray area between the interpretation, the text in French and the text in English. Back in 1935, a Supreme Court judgment came down that decided on something on the basis of the French meaning, the meaning of the French legislation as opposed to the English legislation. And we count on the Supreme Court to have that degree of nuance and understanding, to be able to say, actually in this case, it is the English meaning which should prevail, or it's the French meaning which should prevail, because these are not, one is not a translation of the other. They are co-written.
Let's, in our last few minutes here, talk about neither French-speaking people or English-speaking people, but everybody else.
Yes.
A country of allophones. For the first time, allophones, that is people whose mother tongue is neither English nor French, represented fully 1/5 of the population of Canada, according to the census. Anglophones, those people who reported English as their mother tongue, still accounted for the majority of Canadians. Although their numbers rose, their share of the population declined. The same was true of Francophones, or people who reported French as their mother tongue. That's StatsCan from a few years ago. As the makeup of Canada continues to change, does Pierre Trudeau's vision of bilingualism, which is what we're talking about, I think, at the end of the day, does it still make sense?
First of all, let me say, I like to think of this as Lester Pearson's vision, which Pierre Trudeau applied and translated into legislation. Okay. And I think that we should all understand that this is not Pierre Trudeau's dream. This was Lester Pearson's recognition of the nature of the country, and it was his dream. He said that he thought and hoped that he would be the last unilingual prime minister, and he was.
And he was.
But let's look at those immigrants who come to Canada. Often what is said, and it's often said by unilingual English-speaking Canadians, oh, we really should stop talking about linguistic duality because of the diversity. We should be teaching our kids Chinese rather than French. Those are usually people who actually aren't going to learn Chinese or French. Often the immigrants who come to this country are attracted to this country because of the ideal they have of Canada as a bilingual country.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we know that?
Well, for one thing, Canadian Parents for French recently did a poll, found that something like 60% of the allophone parents that they talked to were attracted to Canada, wanted their children to learn French, felt that this was part of Canadian identity, felt that becoming a Canadian, fully a Canadian, meant fully understanding the country as a whole, which meant being able to speak both of our official languages. The Chinese community in Vancouver made a special request to the French ambassador to open an office of Alliance Française in a Chinese community center. Before David Johnson, we had 2 governors general in a row who were visible minority refugees who came to this country as young girls, one from Hong Kong, one from Haiti. They both joined one language community and decided growing up that to fully become Canadian, to fully participate in the national conversation, they should become not only competent but eloquent in the other official language. Adrienne Clarkson and Michael Jean. And I think that those of us like Canadians like you and me who are not from visible minority communities tend to underestimate what a powerful message Adrienne Clarkson and Michael Jean have sent to the immigrant communities, the allophone communities, the visible minority communities of this country.
That's a nice place to leave it. Graham Fraser, it's good of you to join us here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.